started here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Brian Ahuja. Happy for you all to be here at this salon with Charles Pillar. A little bit about Charles. He's an investigative journalist for Science Magazine, and his work has appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Sacramento Bee, and more. He's reported on public health, biological warfare, infectious disease outbreaks, and other topics from all over the world, including the US, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Central America. He's been honored with many national journalism awards and is the author of Gene Wars, The Failsafe Society, and his most recent book, Doctored, Fraud, Arrogance, and Tragedy in the Quest for the Cure for Alzheimer's. So welcome, Charles.
Thanks so much, Brian. I'm delighted to be here with you
So,
and with everyone.
yeah, no, delighted to have you. So for those of you who may not know me, I am actually a neurologist by training. So this topic is actually, um, especially poignant because I have had experience dealing with patients with Alzheimer's on a clinical basis, at least. Never had any uh, family that's had it, fortunately. And it is a very tough disease to deal with. And so it's interesting seeing this book because it seems like it was quite a big undertaking. So I guess the first question I have is if you'd be able to like share what actually inspired you to write this book.
Sure. Thanks for that question, Brian. So this book got started really back in late 2021, and I became connected with a neuroscientist and neurologist at the Vanderbilt University, a guy by the name of Matthew Schrag. And Matt is someone who, for a long time prior to my ever meeting him or talking with him, was deeply concerned with scientific integrity issues, really out of concern for the validity and furtherance of his goal of being someone who can contribute to ultimately finding a solution to the Alzheimer's problem in his lab. And also, of course, he treats patients as a clinician and is deeply concerned about being able to offer them the best information, the best possible treatments. So Matt and I began to talk about a particular kind of gnarly situation involving a drug called simufilm, which was created by a company called Cassava Sciences. And that is a long tale that I'm happy to go into, but I'll pass over for the moment and try to give you the stage setting for why this became a bit of an obsession for me, this question of integrity in Alzheimer's research and what the implications of misconduct might be in the field. What happened was that in the course of our initial conversations, Schrag had been looking into this drug, simufilm, and had been finding numerous examples of apparently doctored basic research images associated with the drug's development. And these are the experiments that I'm sure many of the listeners know are what leads up to FDA approval for the development of a drug for clinical experiments. Those are tests with people, of course. And what Schrag found was that these experiments were highly suspect and appeared to have been based on improper image doctoring, kind of photoshopping, if you will, of some of the scientific images that underlay the validity of moving that into human trials. So very serious set of circumstances. But what really drew me in, I think more remarkably and interestingly, was that in the course of this, he stumbled across a study that had been one of the most important and most cited studies in the scientific literature on the topic of basic science of Alzheimer's disease in many years. And this was an experiment done at the University of Minnesota by an illustrious scientist there, a woman by the name of Karen Ash, who had made many contributions to the field, and her protege, a guy by the name of Sylvain Lesné, a French scientist who was working in her lab at the time. And this experiment was pretty interesting. It was something that got to the heart of something called the amyloid hypothesis. And this is the predominant kind of dominant, you should say, I should say, way of thinking about the disease, the idea about the origin and cause of Alzheimer's that has the primary mind share in the field, and it has the primary funding in the field, and has the big names in the field behind it. So it's a very, very important set of ideas about Alzheimer's disease. And maybe I'll just take one step back briefly to provide a little context, if that's okay. Um, Actually, I'm going to take one giant step back very briefly, and that is back to the origins of the first descriptions of this disease. And that was by, of course, the German scientist Alzheimer back in 1906. And what Alzheimer found was that he had been treating a patient who had terrible dementia. And after this woman died, he was also a pathologist and he examined her brain tissue and found two kinds of proteins in her brain. One, amyloid proteins, and these are the characteristic sticky plaques that we think of associated with Alzheimer's disease. And the other was these tau proteins. These are another very important type of protein associated with Alzheimer's that are called tangles because of their kind of string-like tangled shape. They are within nerve cells in the neurons of the brain, and the plaques are outside of the nerve cells. And what Alzheimer described was a disease that contained three elements: plaques, tangles, and dementia. That was Alzheimer's disease. Now, not that much happened in the way of intensive research into this disease for decades. And the reason is purely demographic. And that's because back in the 1900s, 1910s, 20s, 30s, et cetera, there were just not that many people living to the late old age. That is the time when Alzheimer's would characteristically take place. And consequently, people were aware of this disease. They were aware of it, of dementia, and were concerned about it. But there just wasn't a giant community of interest studying it because of the relatively low number of people who had the disease. That all changed in the 50s, 60s, 70s when vaccines, antibiotics, remedies for heart disease and cancer started to come online. And suddenly we were seeing lifespans increase so broadly that there were many, many people living to old age. And the incidence of Alzheimer's disease greatly, greatly grew. Consequently, a lot of money was dumped into the field and a lot of study done. And in the 80s and then early 90s, an idea was developed about how Alzheimer's developed, something called the amyloid hypothesis. And what this entailed is really pretty simple to describe. It described a situation where the accumulation of these amyloid proteins within the brain, and initially it was thought to be primarily the sticky plaque form of amyloid protein, but also expanded later to soluble forms of amyloid protein that can kind of float around in the cerebrospinal fluid, that these led to a series of biochemical changes in the brain that caused cell death and eventually dementia. So that, in a nutshell, is the amyloid hypothesis. Now, what I'm about to describe is a kind of a seminal moment in the history of research into the disease and a seminal moment for me to circle back to your question and answer it directly, Brian, how I became interested in this topic. And that's as follows. So in 2006, it was a kind of discouraging moment for the field because there had been a lot of research into the amyloid hypothesis. There had indeed been drugs developed to kind of flush these amyloid proteins out of the brain. And yet, what they found was even though these drugs were very, very effective at that basic task, removing the amyloids from the brains of Alzheimer's sufferers, they were not effective at all in reducing or arresting the symptoms of the disease, or even slowing cognitive decline. And so they were a complete failure as a remedy, even though they were successful at attacking what was thought to be the linchpin, the biochemical linchpin to the disease. But then in 2006, a very clever experiment took place that I mentioned, done by these two scientists primarily at the University of Minnesota. they refined a certain type of amyloid protein, something they called amyloid star, I'm sorry, amyloid beta star 56. And this star protein, their star protein, they then refined and injected into the brains of rats. And these rats then began to show the symptoms of memory loss that are associated with Alzheimer's dementia. And so, for the first time, scientists were seeing what was described as a cause and effect relationship between, in a sense, a specific substance and Alzheimer's disease, albeit in animals, of course, but still something that was powerful in its influence, that took the scientific world by storm, that suddenly became one of the most cited and one of the most honored publications in the history of the disease, including some of the highest honors in neuroscience given to Karen Ash for being the leader of this experiment, even though she was the principal investigator. Her associate, Sylvain Lesné, was also deeply involved in it from beginning to end. So what happened was, to circle back again to your question, Brian, is that Matthew Schrag had stumbled across this study in a bigger look at Alzheimer's disease papers. And he was looking at these papers with an eye towards refining his understanding of how to spot possible image doctoring that might invalidate the findings of an experiment and call into question something that the field might have accepted as very important development in the field. And when he realized that there were a number of apparently very, very significantly doctored images within this very important paper that had been one of the most cited in the field, that had reinvigorated faith in the amyloid hypothesis and had reminded people and convinced people that, yes, we were on the right path to pursue the treatment of Alzheimer's in this way. When he saw those, he was pretty stunned. And I remember the conversation I had with him. This was in January of 2022, when we both looked at this together and thought about it together. And we were pretty much both experiencing a moment of stunned silence, realizing that the effect of this, if true, if his results, his findings were true, it called into question a really significant bedrock, one of the significant bedrocks of the disease and its understanding. And so that was the genesis of my interest in pursuing this, which became a multi-year journey to look at an incredibly broad range of research, and not just research, but also the history of the disease and the individuals' stories that traced it out. And that was why Doctor began. I didn't know it was going to be a book then. It was initially just a story about this finding of Schrag's.
So you'd reported about the reporting that you did actually revealed not just isolated cases, but more systemic issues in general with Alzheimer's research. So what do you think were some of the most surprising institutional or cultural factors that you uncovered that allowed for all this to take place from your
Sure.
perspective?
Yeah. So over the course of my reporting and study for the book, I enlisted a group of what are called forensic image analysts. And these are people who sometimes refer to themselves as image sleuths. And they look at scientific images with an eye towards understanding whether they were properly conducted and whether these images might have been changed improperly using a program like Photoshop that could serve to uh, essentially artificially demonstrate the hypothesis that they were trying to prove out through a legitimate experiment. And so, if I may just describe very briefly, just to provide a little bit of a visual context for listeners, then I can answer your question directly about the
Yeah,
institutional issues. But
by all means.
uh, what this often involves is two different types of images. So these are images that are critical to understanding Alzheimer's disease. One is something called micrographs, which are highly enlarged images, usually in this case of brain tissue. And of course, this is almost always from deceased patients or from animals. And these examples of brain tissue show a lot of granularity. You can see the actual neurons, and you can see the connections between cells, and you can see other features within the brain tissue. And if a person's trying to show something within the brain tissue, say the effect of a drug, or perhaps the pathological effects of certain proteins like amyloid proteins, they want to be able to demonstrate it in these so-called micrographs. And what people who are doing this image doctoring might do is they might use a program like Photoshop to copy and paste certain features within a larger image and to clone them and repeat them within an image to demonstrate a certain point or to accentuate a finding that they had improperly. They might also take portions of an image and reproduce it in a different part of an experiment or in a different experiment altogether in such a way as to start to try to show a visual proof of an idea that they had that's actually the product of image doctoring, and of course, totally illegitimate. The second kind of image that is so characteristically changed in Alzheimer's research is something called Western blot. And this is a classic scientific test to examine the amounts and types of proteins within a tissue or blood sample. And these Western blots appear to be a kind of series of stacked bands, irregularly shaped stacked bands. And they're photographic images produced of these blots. And they lend themselves, unfortunately, to the same kind of image manipulation, moving these bands around within a blot, or changing their intensity, or removing them completely using an erasure tool, or accentuating certain bands if you're trying to demonstrate that your sample had a certain kind of protein or had an effect on a protein in a certain way. And so these two types of possible image manipulation, the Western blots and the micrographs, are sort of at the core of what a lot of the findings are in Alzheimer's disease when you're trying to understand the possibility that images have been improperly altered. And so the question came up in the course of my work is that what I found, just to state it very briefly, is that this kind of improper alteration is incredibly common in the field. And I didn't, of course, I didn't trouble myself or readers with examples of this that were either unimportant, relatively trivial, or might even have at times been the product of mistakes that were made in the science, because innocent mistakes are made. We're all people. This can happen. What I concentrated on was a pattern of problems, a pattern of examples within an important set of research that called into question scientific ideas, some of which were important overall in the field. And so my findings included dozens of scientists, many of them leaders in the field, who had apparently for decades been involved in image doctoring in a way to suggest the success of certain experiments that were in fact either dubious or unsuccessful. This is, of course, very troubling. And to answer your question directly, Brian, I see the scientific community as being backstopped by four kinds of very important institutional authorities. The funders, including most prominently the National Institutes of Health, which is the leading funder of not just Alzheimer's research, but of virtually all biomedical research, I should say. The second is the FDA, which is the regulator for drug development. The third is universities, which are an important overseer of the quality of scientific work globally. And fourth is the scientific journals, the journals that are the gatekeepers of knowledge, the ones who we trust to look carefully at how the science is conducted and to screen out studies that are either unworthy just not important enough to publish, or perhaps done illegitimately. And so what I found was that none of these institutions were exhibiting the care and the vigilance and the priority on filtering out the possibility that some of the work had been done improperly. And in particular, I found that they were complacent, and I would say, unfortunately, quite arrogant at times in assuming that somehow, because their respected colleagues had submitted these papers or these grant proposals, that they were in some way above reproach. And my findings, based on years of work by this team of forensic image sleuths that worked with me as a help for the book, in addition to my own examination of the overall background of these studies and their significance and influence. To me, it was pretty sobering to see that these agencies were falling down on the job, and it formed a key part of my analysis in the book as well.
It's interesting you bring up the journal part. Um, I guess with the role of the journals who are obviously, reviewing, publishing, well, because they engage in, or at least what's supposed to be is, peer review, which I don't know if you could go into a little bit of that, like, the whole, I guess, concept or idea of like, peer review, which in theory should be used to, filter out some of the, either more like dubious studies or stuff that, if they happen to encounter something that, doesn't seem right, and yet somehow this was able to pass through them. I mean, even that, and also I guess the idea of 'cause I know a big issue uh, when it comes to doing scientific studies, especially in medicine, is the tendency to want to publish, I guess, positive or breakthrough results, and if there's any negative results, um, that tends to get kind of shelved. Um, it doesn't seem that, like, when people try to do experiments to reproduce results, we have this whole replication crisis. I mean, how much of that were you seeing in there, and how much do you think that contributes to, the issues that you encountered?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question, Brian, in part because you have to ask the question, if there is a significant amount of image doctoring and other forms of scientific misconduct, what's the reasons for it? And before I answer your question directly, let me just say that I believe firmly, not just based on my own examination of this subject, but from scientists who have done studies of this more broadly, that only a very small percentage of scientists engage in misconduct of this kind, or really of any kind. Look, I think we have to face the fact that scientists are like people in any walk of life. There's a small number who will cut corners, cheat, and sometimes engage in outright fraud for personal gain or for other motives, other terrible motives, and are willing to sacrifice not just quality, but to have other terrible effects on the field for their own benefit. And so this happens, it happens regularly. It even happens with important, illustrious people in the field, as I have pointed out numerous examples of that in my book. But I would still say that it's relatively rare. Now, it being relatively rare doesn't mean it's unimportant. As I've shown in the book, even a small percentage of overall research being faked or doctored or the product of other kinds of misconduct can have a deleterious effect because it can skew thinking in the field. It can steer funds in the wrong direction, precious funds that we need for legitimate research. And it can be very difficult to disprove. And now, circling back directly to your question, there are some perverse incentives in the way in which the success of scientists works in the academic world. And one of these is that the degree of competition is so intense in the publish or perish environment of academic science that people they have limited funds. They know that if they have unsuccessful experiments, it can be very difficult on them because it's very difficult, impossible often to get a lack of success published in a journal. They need those publications to advance or even to survive in their careers. Consequently, you see numerous examples of people who are engaging in these illegitimate activities, image doctoring or other corner cutting or other types of fraud, in part, I think, because of the imperatives that are placed on them in the system. Second, you asked about peer review. And I should say that while peer review is essential to the scientific process, and in my view, often works quite well, it has its limitations. One of the limitations is that peer reviewers are not expected, nor do they regularly have the skill to examine images for possible fraud or other or more pedestrian image doctoring that might not be outright fraud, but might change certain elements of a figure in such a way that you'd want to raise questions about it. And so I'll tell you a small anecdote from my own work. I was looking at the work of a scientist by the name of Borislav Slachowicz, who is an illustrious guy, or I should say was, until my story in Science magazine appeared in 2023, that showed that he had been engaging in decades of apparent image doctoring associated with his extremely influential work involving the blood-brain barrier, Alzheimer's disease, some stuff related to amyloid proteins, a lot of studies related to stroke. And that when I went to experts in the field, these are some of the top experts in the world associated with the types of studies that Slachowicz was involved in, and showed them the evidence, showed them the examples of apparently doctored images. One of them was a guy who said to me that he was shocked when he saw images from a study that he personally had peer-reviewed a few years earlier. And he said to himself, I should have caught this. But I didn't see it. I didn't notice it because we're not trained to do that. We're not asked to do that. And it's understandable because we can't expect every peer reviewer to be an image sleuth because it's its own skill. And these folks may have really, really deep scientific knowledge, but not the knowledge, interest, or ability to do this kind of forensic image analysis. So that's a problem. The responsibility should, of course, lie with the journals themselves, who have the staff and can easily get access to the digital tools that allow them to use AI to do a first pass over these images. It used to be that you could only do this by eye. You could only examine these images and come to understand where the flaws might lie, where the possible manipulation might be, by being an expert in just seeing stuff, by having years of experience of examining things and comparing them to other images. But now you have AI tools that can be applied to that, at least as a first pass. It usually requires people to validate the findings of the software because the software is not perfect. But it's much easier to do it than it was before. And I'm proud to say that the scientific journal that I work for, Science, and many others, including Nature, another illustrious and important scientific publication that I might add, was the publisher of that seminal 2006 study that was the study done at the University of Minnesota that I mentioned earlier. They now have put into place these digital examination tools to help reduce the number of images that might slip through that have been doctored. And so there is work that can be done. I think still many journals are complacent. Many journals have not addressed this, or maybe don't have the staff or the funds to try to take it into hand. And I might add that the funders and the regulators, that is, the NIH and the FDA, also are often complacent, do not have the tools, the examiners, and the wherewithal and the desire even to become more vigilant about this. Those institutions that don't do this are failing us. They're failing taxpayers, citizens, other scientists, people who love science have to be on this and to try to demand a higher level of performance out of these agencies and out of these journals and out of the universities that are, again, the overseers of the scientific process. Uh, Brian, I wonder if this would be a good time. If I could interject. Um, right now, we are at an incredibly dangerous and difficult juncture in our history as a nation related to scientific discovery. And that has to do with the work that's being done. I call it work, really. It's a kind of slash and burn approach to reform of scientific institutions going on in Washington by the Trump administration and by some of the people that have been put in place, including Doge and Elon Musk, and attacking the funding and the staffing for the National Institutes of Health, the FDA, and for the pipeline of help and funding going to universities that, in my opinion, is a very wrong-headed approach to trying to gain better performance. Look, I am a critic of these agencies. I feel that they've done a terrible job in addressing these scientific integrity issues. And I feel that, excuse me, that not just have they done a bad job, but they've allowed this kind of misconduct and image doctoring to be uh, looked at as something that's just really not that important even. And so, of course, I'm very critical of the journals, the universities, the funders, and the regulators. We need to demand that they do better, but we also need to support them in doing better by supporting their work and not slashing and burning it. Yes, they need to up their game. They don't need to be defunded. And so I just wanted to make it clear that I really disagree with the approach that's being taken in Washington right now.
Yeah, no, because I think it's kind of gone from one extreme to the other. I think, yeah, there probably could be a better balance with that overall. Um, interesting point you made about the stuff with AI. It's interesting because I'm actually currently here in San Diego at the annual American Academy of Neurology conference. 2 years ago, when I last went to that conference, yeah, this was in 2023 in Boston. There were maybe two or three sessions on AI. Um, and now, I mean, I'm seeing like at least two or three a day. It's probably about like 15 to 20. So, this whole thing with, AI in medicine, is kind of booming. And one of the things I wonder is, as AI tools get better and better and they get, more in the hands of, I guess, regular people, uh, I guess when you have instances, like this with fraud, because you mentioned about amateur sleuths being able to, kind of do their own analysis of, um, these images and discovering that, and these are amateurs, they're people outside of institutions. So when, the institutions fail, you have, you know, people on the outside kind of coming in. And I think my sense would be is that with as AI becomes more ubiquitous, it would allow more and more people to have the potential to, you know, I guess be the I guess the check on all this. I don't know what are your thoughts on that and
Yeah, I think
how
that's
this
a
may in
very
the future, yeah, how this
it's a
could,
very interesting development, Brian, and
yeah.
it's interesting in a few ways. One is that due to the failure of journals to take this seriously for so many years,
Mm.
the emergence of digital tools to examine these images. Initially, all kinds of digital tools, uh, even programs like Photoshop, could be used to analyze the images, not just to doctor images, but to look at them closely. And there are actually a number of computer programs that are built and published by the National Institutes of Health that serve a similar purpose. And so now also with AI, the barriers to entry, if you will, for it to be a freelance image sleuth are much lower. And so what we've seen is this phenomenon of, because of the failure of institutions and journals to do their work and to do it well, that there's been essentially a crowdsourcing of it online. And what you have is hundreds of these, they're, I say, amateur image sleuths. These are not people who are making any money doing this. Very few are making any money doing it. There's a few companies that have hung out their shingles to attract clients who want their work examined. But for the most part, it's people who in their spare time are looking at these things. And that includes Matthew Schrag as well. He was paid at one time for one of his jobs, but the vast majority of his work was done on his own time, and that includes the work that he did for my book. I didn't pay anyone to examine these images. They're all volunteers. And consequently, what you have is a situation of these folks out in the ether who are taking over the essential job of gatekeepers and of caretakers of scientific integrity in a way that I think is very, very important and productive. They're not perfect. They make mistakes. And sometimes there are some of them who become a bit like vigilantes, and even it can border on harassment at times. And I don't subscribe to the idea that because someone made a mistake or even engaged in something that was improper, that their lives should necessarily be destroyed for having done that. And I think, there are some out in the image sleuth community, if you want to call it that, who sometimes may go too far in that direction. But I will say that they performed an essential service and forced attention to this very important issue in a way that it perhaps in no other way could have been forced. And I'm sure that some people listening to this know that there's a website called PubPeer that is a place where a lot of the questions about these possibly doctored images are posted. And it's a place where people can debate and challenge and defend scientific papers in a way that's unique and interesting and has become a clearinghouse for this sort of work. And it's the product of volunteer labor and the product of, in a way, despair of the ability of the normal institutional authorities to do their job properly. So I applaud that sort of work. I think it's essential, has been essential, and perhaps in the future it will become less important because the institutional authorities like journals and universities will start to do a better job at what really is their job to do.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, no, it's be interesting to see, how this all develops, in the future because it's developing fast. That's one thing I've been learning. Um, you've written that Alzheimer's research, has been misled by so much of a focus on the amyloid hypothesis and potentially at the expense of other theories or other ideas. What are some of the alternative theories or treatments that you may have come across during your investigation with all this that you saw was maybe not getting the attention it deserved?
Sure. So let me say that even though my book concentrates a lot on questions about the amyloid hypothesis and challenges to it, it's been the dominant hypothesis because there's a certain logic to it. There's both genetic and biochemical evidence uh, to suggest that amyloid proteins have something to do with Alzheimer's disease. And even the extreme skeptics of the amyloid hypothesis, not all, but most, would agree that these amyloid proteins have something to do with the disease, but not everything to do with it, as is so often the sort of temptation to believe from the people who are the promoters of this hypothesis and those
Um,
who's,
I, I'm one
sorry,
of those people. I'm one of
the,
those people. I think it's like, yeah, it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story.
there you go. And, so part of the objections to, my book, frankly, have been from people who have believed deeply that really the only way we're going to unravel Alzheimer's disease is through the amyloid hypothesis and the amyloid hypothesis only. And they built their careers and their personal fortunes in many cases on attempting to prove out that hypothesis. And when I say personal fortunes, I mean people who, in some cases, have earned millions of dollars in fees from pharma companies that are working on anti-amyloid drugs, and people whose labs and whose universities are funded to the tune of millions or even tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars by those same companies. So there is obviously professional and financial conflicts among some of the critics of my book. But let me address your question directly. So I am not an expert on all of the alternative ideas to the amyloid hypothesis, but let me name a couple that I find fascinating and for which there is already evidence that's being pursued in clinical trials. So one is GLP-1 inhibitors. These, of course, are the kind of so-called miracle weight loss drugs like Wegovy and others that have taken the world by storm in the last couple of years. And what people have found that there is an apparent association between these drugs and the possibility that they might have an effect on early stage dementia, and the possibility that
Just to interject you real quick. So by the GLP-1s, you're talking about, stuff like Ozempic or Mounjaro or yeah. So
exactly right, yeah.
I mean, most people may not know GLP-1, but everybody knows Ozempic at this point. So yeah, but anyways, keep going. Yeah.
And people are beginning to think and beginning to speculate and also to test whether these drugs might have a preventive effect or might have a therapeutic effect. And right now there are some large phase 3 clinical trials going on. And of course, for people that are familiar with clinical trials, that's usually the last big stage before the consideration of licensing by the FDA. And so I don't know what's going to happen in those trials, but I think by next year, we're going to have a clear sense of whether the initial examination as a treatment for Alzheimer's disease might be something that's promising and interesting. Another, I think, very interesting way of looking at it is something called the infection hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease. And this is the idea that latent infections in the brain of uh, things like conditions like herpes or chickenpox might have an influence or even be something that's important in causing brain inflammation and other disorder that could be linked to Alzheimer's dementia. And so right now, for example, there are clinical trials going on looking at whether latent herpes virus infections that are hanging around in the organs, including the brain, long after the cold sores of herpes have resolved, sometimes even decades after, could have this terrible effect of causing dementia. And I think, we'll have more, within a couple of years, we may have some more really interesting information about whether those sorts of tests are fruitful. Another thing, I think people may have heard of this, it's quite recent, last week or so, there was a study in Nature that looked at, and this is not a clinical trial, but it was a kind of so-called natural experiment where they had enormous amounts of data associated with the use of the shingles vaccine. So shingles, of course, is a secondary illness that can occur for people after they had chickenpox and of course, many years before, the symptoms of the chickenpox resolved, but the virus hung around in the body and can cause sometimes very horrific secondary effects called shingles, and that can be extremely painful. And what people are finding from looking at data from hundreds of thousands of patients, some of whom had the vaccine for shingles and some of whom did not, is that it might be that the shingles vaccine has a protective effect against the onset of dementia, Alzheimer's dementia. And consequently, again, we don't know for sure whether this is a cause of Alzheimer's, but it's interesting. It's interesting as a very interesting potential preventive or risk factor. It shows that, and I think this is something that many Alzheimer's scientists would agree with, that Alzheimer's might be a multifactorial disease, one that might have a number of influences. And, something that I like to say in the talks I'm giving and in the interviews I give is that uh, Alzheimer's is a terrible disease, and I'm not aware of any preventive or of any nutritional supplement or of any brain game or sort of lifestyle change that can absolutely prevent a person from getting Alzheimer's disease. But we know what some of the risk factors are. We know that high blood pressure, high cholesterol, sedentary lifestyles, poor dietary habits, these can all have an influence on the onset of Alzheimer's disease, either the time you have of the onset or the severity, the rapidity with which terrible symptoms are experienced by someone who gets Alzheimer's disease. And so by taking care of ourselves, by living our best lives, by being conscious of the importance of eating well and treating these treatable conditions like high blood pressure and high cholesterol, we can not just have the benefits in our lives and reap those rewards in everyday life, but we might also be helping ourselves down the line in reducing the likelihood of having a terrible case of Alzheimer's at some time in our more later years.
Yeah. No, there's been a lot of talk lately about, even the role of diabetes um, in Alzheimer's. Like some people colloquially they call it type 3 diabetes. That's why, which, and there's probably something to it because I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of metabolic diseases these days, associated with, um, kind of, modern lifestyles, yeah, being sedentary, not exercising and all that stuff. And maybe that's where, when you were mentioning the GLP-1s, the Ozempics and all those, that's where they may come in because that's originally what it was made for, is for, diabetes, metabolic syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're totally
Yeah,
right, Brian. In
yeah,
fact, uh, diabetes, of course, are another risk factor for Alzheimer's disease, and
yeah.
treating those diseases with like Ozempic and other drugs like that, it could be beneficial. I think there's a lot of interesting study going on.
Yeah, yeah. No, there was actually when you mentioned about the studies going on with it, there was somebody just here yesterday that presented on that. Somebody from London. They've been doing um, some clinical trials looking at GLP-1s and um, its ability to, it won't cure Alzheimer's necessarily right now, but showing some noticeable change in progression, slowing of progression also. That'll be interesting to see down the line for sure. Um, and beyond Alzheimer's, what lessons from Doctor do you think apply to other fields of scientific research, or even how we would evaluate, quote unquote, breakthroughs in medicine? And do you think there are any like red flags to watch out for? Uh, but
Yeah,
when these claims on new treatments are made.
sure. I mean, I think we all have to be skeptical of scientific developments, but not skeptical to the point of cynicism, of course. Look, we've seen enormous, enormous benefits from scientific and biomedical research over the years. And one of the reasons why Alzheimer's to me was of particular interest to examine from this perspective is that unlike cancer, unlike heart disease, which are the two biggest killers in the United States, these are diseases for which there have been breakthroughs, remedies that have reduced the death rates from those diseases. In Alzheimer's, we don't have a good treatment yet. We don't have a treatment that either arrests or reverses the symptoms. And that's why it's particularly tragic when you see doctored studies that are having influence and may have wasted time and thinking in the field. But I guess to answer your question directly is that I think for all biomedical research is subject to these same kinds of problems. And these are the problems of, again, of the incentive structure of science, where people are incentivized sometimes to push through in a way that might be illegitimate for personal gain or to survive in the field. And maybe it would be useful, Brian, if I just mentioned briefly, people have sometimes asked me, why does this happen? What is the motivation for it? What goes through a scientist's head in doing it, and what's the process? And um, of course, I can't read minds, and I don't know for sure what each scientist is thinking who is found to have been engaged in illegitimate actions associated with doctored images. But what I can say is that I think a pattern emerges. So we talked a little bit about publish or perish. We talked a little bit about the extreme competition for funding. And so it's easy to see that in some cases, a scientist might be trying to pretty up images because journal editors are like all of us. They want not just truth, but beauty in their pages, and beauty in the scientific sense, of course. And when a scientist looks at an image and they think, if I just make these slight alterations to remove elements of it that are really, in a way, sort of irrelevant but distracting, or to tighten up the image in a way that it looks better, it has a bit of what you might call curb appeal for the scientific editors, then they think I'm not doing really anything wrong. I'm not fundamentally altering the experiment, but I might increase my opportunity for having it published. And this is not uncommon, and it's frowned upon, but really it's overlooked so much in the scientific community. But then sometimes what happens is you you go down a bit of a slippery slope, and scientists might say, okay, well, I am quite sure that this weak finding is important. And so I'm just going to accentuate it in the image a tiny bit so that the study it becomes sharper and clearer and is more likely to get published. And then when they see they get away with it because there is a lot of complacency among the scientific publishers and peer reviewers who don't look to examine the images in that way, then they think, okay, that was no big deal. And they might continue down that path. The next time they might think, I know my ideas are really important, even though they're not being shown really clearly in the experimental findings. I know my next experiment is going to do that. And in order to have that next experiment, I really need this publication. I really need to show the funders and the university and my peers that I'm doing something important. And so more significant alterations are made in the image to demonstrate a hypothesis that wasn't exactly proven by the work itself. This, of course, is really scientific misconduct. But because people get away with it, they think they become impenetrable. They become someone who is living above the conventional scientific requirements and methods. And unfortunately, it happens all too often. And so what I would just say is that it's a human instinct, survival and success. Now, of course, you don't just see it with junior scientists who are making their way in the field. You see it with senior scientists, of course, in cancer research, in heart disease research, in Alzheimer's, in all different scientific fields, physics for that matter. And what's so discouraging is when you see it among illustrious leaders in the field, then you know that you're hitting a very difficult spot, a spot where they have the power to steer things in an inappropriate way. And just to give you an example from my own findings in the work for the book and work that I've done for Science magazine, one really discouraging example was that the guy who was the head of the Division of Neuroscience for the National Institutes of Health. And so this is the part of the National Institutes of Health. I should say he was doing it that head of that division for the National Institute on Aging, which is a institute within NIH. And this was a very discouraging example. A guy who had an enormous amount of power to steer the world of neuroscience research, largely in Alzheimer's, but also in Parkinson's disease and other neurological conditions. What we found, and when I say we, I mean this team of neuroscientists with whom I worked, this team of image sleuths, including a neuroscientist, Matthew Schrag, and including the other colleagues that joined that effort, who were themselves forensic image analysts, found that this guy, whose name is Eliezer Maslia, had been for decades working on studies that were the product of image doctoring, apparently the product of image doctoring for years, and compiled a 300-page dossier involving 132 of his papers. So this was a sobering finding because it wasn't just any scientist. It was one of the most influential scientists in neuroscience. And it was the product of decades of work, including both before he became the division director of this very important element with a multi-billion-dollar annual budget in the federal government, but also after he joined that agency and had his own lab within NIH. So what you see is that when a very important person is involved in this sort of misconduct, you can have very deleterious effects that haunt the field for a long time afterwards. And Um, Unfortunately, when this happens, there needs to be a reckoning. There needs to be an opportunity for the field to essentially take a good hard look in the mirror and say, where have we let people down and what do we need to do to improve our practices so that our reliability is higher and more important in a way, the faith of the public is restored in this work, this very, very important work, because notwithstanding these terrible examples, most scientists are deeply determined to do the right thing and would never engage in this sort of misconduct. And um, unfortunate thing is that skepticism arises from these terrible examples of misconduct and leads to, I think, unfortunately, some of the generalization by people who are skeptics and even opponents of scientific progress and who are willing to criticize science a whole cloth because of the actions of some people. Yes, we need to improve practices. Yes, we need to become more vigilant. But again, I would condemn the wholesale approach to reforming agencies, which amounts to slashing and burning their activities.
You mentioned something about the incentive structures and all. There are a couple of people in the audience that are already asking about yeah questions regarding the whole idea of like the incentive structures with in the scientific community. I'll read one here. Um, so he's saying that universities get some or about like half of all R1 money, which I think R1 is like whatever, like the highest tier of research.
Just to
Uh,
clarify,
yeah.
R01 grants are very, very important because they're
Mm.
generally have the possibility of extending for 5 years. So these are the
Oh,
grants that keep the lights on in basic scientist
yeah.
labs.
Yeah. So, so he goes on to say, so speaking as someone who did funding heavy physics research, I don't see the incentive for universities to police academic malfeasance so long as they think it won't be caught. If there was an honor system similar to grade deflation, I guess this was something that was done back in Princeton some years ago, that might be ameliorated. Any input on this could be appreciated. And
Yeah,
saying, I say
it's a
similar for white hat
mhm,
rewards for coding exploits.
yeah, it's a terrific question and very important one. So you have to ask um, a little bit to understand how the review process goes when there's alleged misconduct. And so normally the way it works is if the NIH is notified that one of its grantees may have engaged in improper image doctoring, they'll do a very cursory examination. They'll send it on to a small, tiny agency within the Health and Human Services Department called the Office of Research Integrity. And
Mm.
this agency, they have experts and examiners, but just a tiny handful of them. And so they can't look at the incredible amount of work and detail associated with a misconduct investigation. And so they send it back to the home institution, the home university of the professor where the allegations are subject, the person who's subject to the allegations. So this results normally in uh, months or even years of delay because these institutional investigations that take place are ponderously long and they're secret. And so what happens is you have the institutions, the universities, that have the most to lose in money and in reputation from doing a robust, prompt, vigorous, and publicly accessible investigation of alleged misconduct, and the least to gain from doing that. The most to lose, the least to gain. They're the ones responsible for it. And so what do you see? You see so often uh, investigations that take forever and often have equivocal results. Often the professors who are accused are exonerated even when evidence is incredibly strong. And so I would just say that, of course, individuals who are accused of possible misconduct, they are owed due process. They are owed a deliberate process, a process where they can defend themselves. But they can't have it be done in a way that's acceptable to the public, in my view, by having it done at their own institutions. There needs to be the development of an independent agency that is outside of the jurisdiction of the home institution of these professors who can take charge of that. Now, it doesn't mean that it can't be an agency that doesn't have really strong buy-in from universities. And it probably should be funded by universities because right now they're funding these institutional reviews anyway, but they're just doing it, unfortunately, with in many cases, a lack of experience and expertise to be able to do the best possible job and with the conflicts of interest that I mentioned. So we need to reform that process. And I think that the question from the listener is apt because right now the process doesn't lend itself to effective results.
Yeah, no, and he has a follow-up here. And actually, this is something I've been wondering too. Do you think like increased funding for labs that do replication studies would be, uh, a good, good of good use? Because I've actually kind of wondered this too, if there was like, I mean, I don't know if this would necessarily need to be like a government institution or some sort of like independent institution that, essentially is like a department of replication. So that's like all they'll do is just replication studies. Because again, there isn't really much of a incentive to, get that out, get those published. It doesn't really tend to advance people's careers the way that, supposed breakthrough results will.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a great question. And so of course I would say absolutely there should be much more funding for replication studies. Um, partly because let me just give you back this example of the study by Karen Ash and Sylvain Lesne at the University of Minnesota that kicked off my book. And one of the reasons why this was a tragic situation and why it was so influential is that even though there were labs that had tried to replicate that experiment unsuccessfully, for the most part, those were never published. In fact, no study that attempted to replicate that research was ever published. And the reason was twofold. One is, as you say, it's expensive to do, it's difficult to do, and then you often can't get it published. But secondly, even if you could get it published, it can be perilous for a scientist to challenge big names in the field. And in this case, the name Karen Ash, who was an illustrious, important scientist in Alzheimer's research, was the principal investigator for that study. And to say, we tried to do this and we couldn't do it, and we wonder whether this is a true result, that can really be sometimes a career killer, especially for a young scientist trying to work their way up through the pipeline of prestige. And so I would say there needs to be, yes, incentives built into science for replicating studies, funding for it. And I would add, there needs to be training, integrity training that's built into the scientific education process for young investigators who are just getting started to have it become part of their principal understanding of what their obligation is in the field, what their role is, and how you produce science that is possible to replicate well, that is possible to do in a way that upholds the highest values of integrity that we can rely on as consumers of science.
Mm, so I guess this ties into another question from someone in the audience. So they're asking, besides the Lesney paper, which was cited many times and not replicated, which other papers, if any, about the amyloid hypothesis have been shown to be fraudulent?
Hundreds,
Hundreds.
uh, hundreds. And I wouldn't use the word fraudulent, it's actually more of a legal term than a
Mm,
scientific term. But
mm,
in the course of the work for Doctored, the team of forensic image sleuths that I worked with examined many hundreds of papers and found apparent image doctoring in about 600. And among those 600 papers, the majority were associated with aspects of the amyloid hypothesis. And so yes, many, many, many papers that go really to the heart of things. Now, does that mean that every paper associated with the amyloid hypothesis is false or has been doctored? Of course not. Um, and as I said at the outset, I think the amyloid hypothesis that that amyloid proteins have something to do with Alzheimer's disease, just not everything to do with it. So why were there so many papers with doctored images associated with that hypothesis? Well, I think it's apparent that when you have a dominant way of thinking in the field, then the temptation to doctor images for personal gain, for advancement in the field, can be a lot more intense, can be a lot more successful if you are adhering to the conventional wisdom. Because people are thinking, well, of course we expected to get this result. It's consistent with the dominant way of thinking in this field. It's consistent with the dominant way we think experiments should come out with. And then consequently, you see that the majority of the work that we found was associated with the amyloid hypothesis because of I think what could be called groupthink associated with the field. And when you have an expectation that something will come out a certain way, you don't look closely to see if an image might have been doctored to produce that result.
Um, let's see, a few more questions here. Someone's asking, well, what subset of research on Alzheimer's and dementia is still reliable?
Well, let me just say again that I think the vast majority of research that's done in the field, whether it's the amyloid hypothesis or other ways of looking at the disease, is reliable. Whether it's important or not is another question, but it is reliable in that it's been done with integrity and it's been done with the highest aspirations of doing experiments that are, as you say, Brian, replicable and possibly important. But again, that doesn't mean that it's moving the field forward. There's a lot of science that's out there that is honest, but just not that important or not that interesting. And so I think what we need to remember is that the field of Alzheimer's research is frustrating because, again, even though there are drugs on the market, they're unfortunately not very effective. And as a result, we don't have any remedy for Alzheimer's disease that arrests or reverses the symptoms of the disease. And consequently, we are hoping and wishing that scientists who are people of integrity who want to try to advance the field will have success in the future. It does not mean that the whole body of research that their work rests on, and it rests on failure as well as success. It does not mean that we won't see the fruit of those labors coming forward in the next years to come.
Another question here. Person says, curious to know what you think about University of Minnesota, as in, are they still a reputable institution? Sylvian Lesnay was still employed there well after the scandal broke and only resigned recently. But you said that, they're using tech to scan for this type of fraud going forward. Do you think they've done enough?
No, I don't think they've done enough. I mean, I would just say, I'll answer the question directly about the University of Minnesota. I think they have a terrible track record. They've had numerous problems, not just the scandal that I wrote about in the pages of Science Magazine and in my book, but other problems with clinical trials and with basic research over the years. And some of those are described in my book. Now, is it unique? Of course not. Other universities have problems. For example, the University of Southern California, which is also featured in my book, has had a lot of problems. A lot of universities have problems, but I would say that the University of Minnesota in particular has been complacent in certain ways. And we've seen example after example of scandal at that university as a result. So one of the issues, I think, is that universities go into a protective crouch and circle the wagons whenever any possible scandal emerges. And instead of dealing with it forthrightly and in an open way, they tend to try to prevent information from coming out. I think the problem with that approach is that it builds mistrust. It builds a kind of sense that there is more to find. And maybe sometimes there is more to find. So, you know, the result of that, I think, is twofold. One, we need to have more openness, but two, we need to have other entities. We need to have independent institutions that are involved in the examination process when these kinds of problems emerge to build public trust, to build trust in these institutions that are receiving public funds, and also that we rely on for breakthroughs and for the advancement and furtherance of scientific knowledge.
Another question here. Someone's asking, do you think the same problems in scientific research also exist in human clinical trials and NDA submissions?
I'm sorry, what submissions?
And NDA, I'm actually not sure what it just says NDA, but I guess like
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, so um, the short answer is yes. There's no question that they do. Um, the extent of it can be hard to judge because those, you know, what I think the questioner is talking about is submissions of packages to FDA as part of the drug approval process. Excuse me. And so consequently, a lot of those are not public information and because they're proprietary. So it's harder to examine those. Also, when those packages do become public, often the quality of the images displayed within them can be poor. And as a result, they're hard to examine for possible image doctoring. So yeah, I think it's a big problem. But let me give you an example of how I think the key regulator in this, which of course is the Food and Drug Administration, has at times fallen down on the job. And this is the package related to this company, Cassava Sciences, that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion. And this is a company that developed a drug called Simufilum. And this drug was questioned years ago for the possibility that the basic science underlying the package delivered to FDA so that it could be approved for human trials, that this basic science was the product of misconduct, the product of doctored scientific images. And this guy I mentioned earlier, Matthew Schrag, who's a principal character in my book, he was involved in developing a dossier associated with that basic science behind Simufilum. And this dossier was delivered years ago to the NIH, which was a partial funder of that work, and to FDA, which was the regulator considering the advancement of that drug into phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. And there was example after example, image after image, suggesting very strongly that the drug was not legitimate, that was based on doctored images and couldn't be trusted as a proper remedy to be given to human beings. And yet, the Food and Drug Administration did not intervene in any way. They just let it go through. And I might add that there were other problems associated with it, with the drug, including the FDA's own laboratory examiners went into one of the key labs associated with this set of clinical experiments involving this drug Simufilum. And they found over and over that the lab testing was based on illegitimate methods, unreproducible methods, methods that their own examiners called attention to and delivered reports to the federal agency saying these methods were improper, they can't be trusted. What did the FDA do? Nothing. They did nothing. They just allowed the trials to continue. They allowed patients to believe that they were being given a drug that might potentially be important in arresting or even reversing their cognitive decline, Alzheimer's patients. And to me, this was a terrible, terrible lapse on the part of the agency. So ultimately, I should add that that drug crashed and burned. It was shown to be really useless in the treatment of the disease, and it was withdrawn for testing by the
I
company.
think just recently, right? Last month, if I'm not
Yeah, it was
mistaken.
very, very recently. Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
recently, I know there's been a lot of issues with, like yeah, Cassava got like fined by like the SEC, or there's a whole, there's a whole
$40
bunch of
million
stuff.
dollars in SEC
Yeah, I know it's
penalties for securities fraud related issues. That was an SEC settlement. No, they did not admit fault, but of course they paid $40 million to the SEC. One of the chief scientists of work on that drug was indicted by the Department of Justice, indicted many months before the drug was withdrawn and the clinical trials failed. What did the FDA do when that scientist was indicted for fraud associated with his work on simufilm? They did nothing. So yes, the FDA really dropped the ball on that. And when people criticize the FDA, it's hard because personally, I think we are very fortunate in this country to have an agency that does a lot of great work and is, in general, a very good overseer of the drug supply and a very good overseer of uh, making sure that safe and effective drugs reach the public. But let's face it, they really have a lot of room for improvement, and they occasionally drop the ball in ways that are harmful or deleterious to not just the drug supply, but to the patients who have given their trust in companies that are testing these drugs.
another interesting question here. I don't know if this is something you may have encountered during your investigation at all, but someone's asking, what are your thoughts on Alan McDonald and Judith McCloskey's autopsies of brains of Alzheimer's patients that showed Borrelia, which is the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, in a lot of the brains? Was there any of that you may have encountered in terms of like alternative theories, like
Yeah,
infection causes for Alzheimer's and
I'm
all?
afraid that I have heard of this. I have not
Yeah.
studied that question. Although I would just say that it's consistent with the overall idea by some people that there may be an infection explanation for at least some element of how Alzheimer's is caused.
Um, and I guess as a follow-up to, the stuff about replication, somebody was saying replication is impossible when sharing data or methods, uh, or when sharing data or methods is itself disincentivized. Labs hoard that so they can publish. Maybe recognizing data for authorship purposes or citations would help create a more honest environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think really the big issue here is openness in research.
Mm.
And the more open scientists are with their data, the more likely it is that people can find both the strengths and weaknesses. And if data is being doctored, getting a lot of eyes on that data is the most important way of finding that out. Now, there is increasingly a move towards scientists showing their work and providing that basic science data, the voluminous data that goes behind an experiment, much, much more than is actually published in journals. And I think that's a very positive development and one that can actually lead to really interesting new findings, new understanding. There's one guy,
Yeah,
for example,
definitely.
that is someone who was very important consultant for me and outspoken in helping me understand the results of some of the work that I did for the book. A guy by the name of Tom Sudoff, who's a Nobel Prize-winning scientist at Stanford, who is a leader in openness of his results. And what happened in his case is that he threw open, an enormous amount of data and posted it on a server from his lab. And as a result, it was examined very carefully by a lot of people, and they found problems in some of his experiments. And it resulted in at least one retraction of one of his papers. Now, there was only one case that I'm aware of where there was a suggestion that one of his um, people in his lab may have been engaging in misconduct associated with that experiment. For the most part, it was innocent and honest mistakes of the kind that are part of everyday life. Scientists being people, stuff can go wrong. And, as a result, they were happy to correct those experiments when that happened. But the point I'm trying to make is that scientists should and increasingly are showing their work, and that is a very positive sign and one that I think will improve the quality of the stream of scientific information.
We're running near the end here. Um, I'll just follow up, with one final question because I mean, you've been doing this, investigating, all this stuff with Alzheimer's for several years, and you have, probably quite more, deep knowledge than most, about, all the workings of Alzheimer's research or whatnot. If you could reform one aspect of how Alzheimer's research is done, whether it be in terms of like conduct, funding, how it's overseen, what do you think would be the single best change, at least like immediate change that could happen to help progress Alzheimer's research forward into helping to prevent or helping to potentially find a cure?
Sure. I think that probably the most productive thing to do would be to increase funding in a variety of areas that perhaps have been squeezed out by the amyloid hypothesis. And there's a lot of lip service paid to studies that are done that are outside of that hypothesis. And I don't mean to give the impression that nothing's being done except work on the amyloid hypothesis. Of course, there's a lot of really important work that's being done. What I think, though, is that the big money, the money that has big pharma behind it, the money that is financing gigantic studies that result in large-scale clinical trials, it's predominantly associated with the amyloid hypothesis. And I think ultimately that's going to change. It has to change, and it will change. The other thing I might leave you with, Brian, that to me is so important and so interesting is that prevention. Look, I said before that I think we do have some agency in this. Living our best lives is its own reward, but it's also rewarded in being potentially effective in forestalling or reducing the effects of Alzheimer's disease late in life. And so, uh, funding prevention, funding for treatment, funding for the kind of social support that caregivers need, that's critical to this solving this problem. It's critical to helping people who are desperately need that help right now. And I sincerely hope that whatever's being done in Washington, that we don't reduce the ability of the federal government and state governments to help supply that sort of social support to people who need it, who are the loving caregivers of Alzheimer's patients as well.
No, I think that's so important what you mentioned about the whole agency aspect that we have, you know, the ability to, improve our own lives now to, at least hopefully, prevent issues in the future. And I think that goes for, any disease, just not, not just Alzheimer's, but
Indeed.
you know. So yeah, we're near the end. I don't know, any final words, any final thoughts
I,
you want to leave on us?
yeah, I would just say that if people are interested in learning more about these issues or taking a look at my book, it's easy to find my website. It's charlespiller.com. There's reviews, there's articles about it, there's links to podcasts that I've been on if you want to hear more discourse about it. We've had a lot today. And also a place to learn more about the book in case you'd like to buy it. Also, ways to contact me if you have additional questions. I'm happy to try to respond.
Where else can they find you? You're on Twitter, I believe, right?
Twitter, Blue Sky, and the Science Magazine website. I've got a page where you can see a wide range of articles, not just about Alzheimer's disease, all kinds of topics that I've covered for science over the last few years. And that's at science.org.
Sounds good. No, this has been a very illuminating discussion. I appreciate your time with all this. Thank you everybody for joining us, and I hope to see you all again at the next salon. So with that, I will bid adieu.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate your joining.